Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Gökşen Çalışkan. I'm Senior Manager at Euractiv. It's my pleasure to welcome you all to our stakeholder workshop today with the title Making Circular Economy, Bioeconomy Circular. We will be answering the question, how far can circular economy principles be applied to the bioeconomy? This is a Euractiv organized event with the support of CEPI, the Confederation of European Paper Industries. Before we start, please allow me to say a few words about Euractiv, especially for those who have not been in our offices before. Euractiv is an online media network specialized in EU policies. We publish online content in different editorial formats in 12 different languages from offices in 12 European capitals, of course with the headquarters here in Brussels. But we just do not publish online content. As you may know, we also organize and host this kind of interactive policy debates with the support of different organizations. This is an offline debate, but we're today having an live streaming as well. So our audience, our guests, both online and offline, you are more than welcome to participate in the discussion. Please join us, send us your questions and comments via Twitter by using the hashtag EADebates. Now I give the floor to the discussion with our journalist and editor, Frédéric Simon, who will be leading the discussion today with us. He will introduce our distinguished panelists, and then we will hear their introductory statements, and then we give the floor to open discussion with your contribution. I will address you again in the end. So I hope you enjoyed today's discussion. Thank you for listening. And Fred, floor is yours.
Thank you, and good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us today for this debate, which is kindly supported by CEPI. The focus of today's discussion is going to be on the bioeconomy and how the circular economy principles can be applied to it. Now, it's a discussion which is becoming increasingly relevant because the European Commission is preparing an update to its bioeconomy strategy, which was initially published in 2012. So now is probably a good moment to take stock and look ahead to what's coming up. Joining me today to discuss those issues is Waldemar Kut, next to me, Head of Unit for the Bioeconomy Strategy at the European Commission's DG Research, William Neal from DG Environment, Franz Bogovic from the European Parliament's Regional Committee, Alex Mason for the WWF, and Sylvain Lotte from CEPI. Welcome to all of you gentlemen. As we heard, each of the speakers will start by making a short introduction of no more than 5 minutes, and then we'll open the floor to your questions or remarks. So feel free to challenge our panelists, and I'll try and take as many questions as possible. This event is live streamed, so beware, anything that you say might be taken up in a forthcoming article on Euractiv. We actually have a journalist in the room as well. I guess that's all for me. Waldemar Kut, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Frederick. The bioeconomy, I think it's best started if giving a definition of it. So the circular economy looks simple by just having the circularity inbuilt. What's the bioeconomy about? The bioeconomy actually encompasses all the areas that produces or uses biological materials. So we're talking about land and ocean sea systems that produce biological resources, but we're looking also at food, feed, and bio-based materials, whether it's textiles, bioplastics, or wood. We're talking about bioenergy and biofuels. So that's the overall idea of the bioeconomy. That's what the bioeconomy is about. And the bioeconomy strategy was set up in 2012 because it's such a complex system and there are different objectives to it, to really develop a strategy so that different objectives can be kind of looked at the same time. And one of them was, of course, food security. I mean, the bioeconomy is first and foremost objectives to feed people. and 70% of the bioeconomy is about food. But it also holds promises, and it has a very important feature in climate change. It also has a very important feature in substituting fossil materials, for instance. But it also has, of course, a very important issue of making production sustainable. You have to do it in the limits of the planet. So there's another thing that you need to look at. And all of this has to be done while you generate jobs and growth. So the bioeconomy tries to really look at these 5 objectives. Some seem to be contradicting itself, and trying to find a balance between those and develop strategies and develop actions that could really do a sustainable bioeconomy. That was the title of the 2012 strategy, Sustainable Bioeconomy in Europe. So we've done a lot of things. Actually, if you look at some of the actions, we had an action on reducing food waste already in 2012, which in the circular economy also came up a bit more prominent. But we looked at some of the issues that were already at that time. We could call it circular. We were looking at nutrient recycling issues. The bioeconomy itself, if you see what's the relation to circular economy, of course it's circular per se. We're talking about new carbon or fresh carbon cycles. So we're using carbon in products through plants. We eat it. We try to recycle it through either composting, or even if you burn it, it gets picked up by plants again. So you have basically a new carbon cycle that you're trying to do with a bioeconomy. So there you already see that there is a circularity element in there. But essentially you have lots of elements that are the same in a circular or a bioeconomy system. It's resource efficiency, it's sustainability. I mean, these are the 2 driving systems of both systems. And I think circularity, as I said, is an element. It can be an element of nutrient recycling, which is very important. But it can also be an element where the bioeconomy, by producing bio-based materials, so if you go into the material cycle of the circular economy, it can produce materials that can substitute other non-biological materials, wood, cement, for instance, or plastics, fossil-based plastics, bio-based plastics. So there's a substitution effect that can help the circular economy become even more resource efficiency, because it can be based on renewable materials instead of non-renewable materials. So I think there is a synergy there, and I think that's the main thing. They are separate. I mean, there's an overlap there, but I think it will be very important to look at these synergies and to develop these further. And we're working, I think, together with our friends in environment to try to do that.
Mm-hmm. Good. Thanks for this introduction, and I'll turn to William Neal immediately, because as Waldemar said, you're working on trying to link those 2 strategies, so tell us more about that.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for the very neat handover, Waldemar. Yes, I mean, I think if we're talking about applying circular economy principles or concepts to bioeconomy, absolutely that's the case. That should happen. They're certainly coherent, but there are specific aspects of the bioeconomy which mean that we need to take maybe a slightly different approach than we do to abiotic material. If you've seen the very famous representation of the circular economy coming from the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, you have the butterfly, you have the abiotic and the biotic. I think it's important to understand that when we're talking about the circular economy, we're talking about those 2 loops, and we're also actually talking about millions of loops and millions of circles. It's about lots of products and materials in their individual cycles. Some of them very long, some of them shorter. One of the specificities of the bioeconomy is that many of those loops are much shorter. You're talking about renewable materials, which is obviously has a certain specificities in terms of the value chains, but quite often shorter time periods, and also quite often more geographically specific loops as well. If you look at the way we developed the circular economy approach over the last 5, 7, 8 years in the Commission, the underlying objective was to decouple the increasing demand coming from global populations and consumption from the impact of that demand. And of course, when we're talking about bioresources, biomaterials, those pressures of demand are particularly strong and important when we're talking about the global demand for food, feed, energy, and materials. We're going to have to double agricultural production globally by 2050, and then balance that with other demands on those biomaterials. The second thing which was underlying the circular economy approach was the fact that the European Union is very poor in materials generally, and this is also the case in biomaterials relatively. If you look at the last 15 years particularly, our consumption growth has been very much based on sources outside Europe, and 22% of the biomass, there's been an increase in the last 15 years of 22% of the biomass which is sourced outside the EU. And I think we're, in terms of the footprint, it's about 33% today of EU footprint in terms of biomass which is coming from outside Europe. So our consumption is very much depending upon biomaterials which are coming from outside the European Union, which is an issue for circularity. How we deal with that? We can look at increasing efficiency, resource efficiency, as Valdemar said. Bioeconomy accounts for about 25% of materials in the EU economy, and about 9% of jobs and production or turnover. So I think there are opportunities there for increasing the value added on those materials. We can look at reducing waste generation. About 30% of, well, we talk about 30% food waste in the European Union. That means also 30% waste of land, 30%, I'm not being very exact here, but we're talking about also value equivalent amounts of wastage in that case of the nutrients that go to produce that food, the land that goes to produce that food, the water that produces that food, and so on. Then managing waste. Food waste, bio waste is about 125 million tonnes per year in the European Union. Only 25% is collected and recycled. And then we can look at development of new products with higher performance. We can look at new sources, such as aquatic sources of biomaterials. So there are many ways in which we can address it. But the circularity, the circular ways of addressing that create some issues and some challenges. For example, Valdemar mentioned nutrient cycles. It's clear in terms of circular approaches. If you look at the fact that phosphorus is now considered as a critical raw material, if you look at the fact that the nitrogen emissions from the EU are going up so drastically, we really need to look at how we can get those nutrients more from our cities, for a start, back to the rural areas, from manure, from waste and bio-waste. We need to look at circular design of products, and here again there are challenges. Mixing biotic and abiotic materials in products can cause problems when it comes to recyclability and circularity. When you're looking at the durability, we're talking about keeping the value in the system in the circular economy. If you want to have durable timber products, you quite often have to add arsenic or creosote, other chemicals which can pose problems for recycling. If you're looking at waste reduction, I think we need to take an approach which is very much based on consumer information. If you're looking at managing waste, I think we're already dealing with this to a large degree in terms of improving the amount of secondary biotic resources and reducing the amount of virgin that is needed. The waste review, which was adopted, well, which will be adopted in about a week, finally, by the Council. We have in there mandatory separate collection for bio-waste by 2023. We have recycling targets for wood and paper, which are increased. We have 10% landfill limit, which means a lot less bio-waste going to that landfill. So there are many circular approaches. They are rather complex. I'll finish there, but I have a few messages which may come out later in the discussion.
Thank you very much, and indeed we'll have plenty of opportunities later on to pick your brains on these issues. Franz Bogovic, your perspective from the European Parliament's Regional Committee.
Yes. Good afternoon. Thank you very much for the invitation. As you said, I'm a member of European Parliament. I'm from Slovenia, and I'm in Regi and Agri committee, so I'm quite close to this team from the both committee where I work on. Otherwise, I'm also agriculture engineer, and I'm apple producer at home, so I have also practical way of this thing we speak about. And I think that we all agree that circular economy is something what is civilization necessity, and it's not fancy, but it's need to do this. We are responsible to do this, and this is the global challenge, and also planetary interdependence is very big, so that all we agree with this, and perhaps Mr. Trump don't, but we other people, I didn't hear that they don't agree with this, that we influence on the world. And this influence on the world and changes is bigger and bigger. And I think that it's in past, these principles of circular economy was something normal, what people do in bioeconomy and also in other sectors. And then in the 60s, where 30 billion people on this planet, and the economy change in this linear economy, and influence on the world is bigger and bigger. And now what is our obligation, what we are responsible to do is go back to the roots and use principles which were used in past also all around us. It will be necessary not only change technology, also it will be necessary to change ourselves. If we speak about use of food, if you speak use of energy, use of anything, if we will just want to switch from bio-based to from fossil-based to bio-based and use the same quantity of energy of anything, we are not in the right direction. So it's much more than just changing technology, and if we want to do this, it's necessary this very good cooperation, and that people are involved in this from, as we speak today, from European Commission perspective, European Parliament perspective. We speak about industry, we speak about NGO, and it's necessary that we go back to national level. So it's very important what happened here in European Parliament in 2013, that in these topics bio-based industry joint undertaking was established, and it's a very important money. It's close to 1 billion public money, which is add to close 3 billion, 2.7 billion private money to push this innovation research and come to new products which make these changes. So I think it's very important that it is part of European Commission goal. The second, what is very important also through this through cohesion policy, there are many tools which are connected with circular economy, also bio-based industry. I think that it's the figures are that around 150 billion of cohesion money in financial perspective 14-20 is connected with circular economy, and also in partnership agreement which are made by government, and beside this smart specialization strategies and other are many strategies which are connected with circular economy, bio-based industry. Netherlands is a country in which we know a lot that this is the main topic of smart specialization. So that I think that it's very important that we have this push, because I was also 13 years mayor, and I was mayor between 1998 and 2011, and I know that we changed a lot of our municipality policies on the base of priorities which we got in this cohesion money and other things. And so I think the influence of European Union is much bigger as only these figures. This influence also on budgets of countries, municipalities, and what is very important that industry and public-private partnership are established, like in this bio-based industry joint undertaking. So I think this is the right direction. For my opinion, it's necessary also in future to to ensure the money for this research innovation, what is necessary, because there must be a lot of new technologies that prices of this biomaterial will be closer to fossil-based materials, which is at the beginning a big problem. How to come on the market with new materials. I think that it's also very important that perhaps we find some other tools like subsidies or taxes, but I usually compare this with renewable energy, and I'm sure that solar energy without public subsidies never reach this level that it is today. No subsidies, and you can work with these energies on the market quite efficient and concurrent. And also, what I think it's necessary at the beginning to use and to combine with these new materials also creativity. And last week we organized, me and my office and Circular Change platform in Slovenia, we organized one great 2 days event, and first day was there were 3 pillars of this event. First was communal waste, what is going on in this topic. The second was bio-based, and the third pillar was creativity. And we show many cases of SMEs, and also, for example, fashion performance with were from natural materials, fair trade materials, such a thing. So that I think that there must be at the beginning some stories beside, and then you can also count on social responsibility that people will use this material.
Okay, thank you very much for this interesting perspective. You'll have plenty more opportunity to share some of these thoughts. Let me turn now to Alex Mason from WWF, and we're all aware that environmental NGOs sometimes have issues with bioeconomy related topics, so tell us more.
Yes. Well, thank you very much for inviting us to participate. As you say, I mean, WWF and other environmental NGOs do have obviously a very big interest in particularly the bioeconomy, which, as our previous speakers have made clear, is a vast topic, and obviously in everything from agriculture and forestry, fisheries, conservation organizations have a big interest in the subject. I mean, I actually work on climate change policy and renewable energy and bioenergy. So I'd like to focus particularly on the, if you like, the climate issues in this area. And I guess my main message, having worked for a few years now on bioenergy, is that the EU's bioenergy policies are in fact a very serious threat to the bioeconomy and the circular economy. And I think it's very important that in developing the bioeconomy, we avoid the mistakes that the EU has made on bioenergy. But I'll come back to that in a second. I think just on the climate side of things, I mean, obviously there are many reasons for supporting a shift to a circular economy and to a bioeconomy, but one of the important ones and the most important now is obviously the need to replace fossil fuels, fossil sources of carbon, and to reduce emissions. We have possibly only 4 or 5 years left globally of emissions if we want to stay inside the carbon budget associated with, say, 1.5 degrees, which is the Paris Agreement target. Now, obviously, we can be thinking about maybe not hitting 1.5 degrees and maybe only managing to keep global temperatures below 2 degrees. But then you're saying that instead of losing, 70% of the world's coral reefs, we lose pretty much all of them at 2 degrees as compared to 1.5. And, coral reefs, obviously dear to our hearts, maybe will seem a long way away, but the other thing you need to think about is the risk of passing various tipping points between 1.5 and 2 degrees, and that becomes a lot more significant at 2 degrees than at 1.5 degrees. So there's there's an enormous urgency, obviously, to reduce emissions, but also to store as much carbon as we can in landscapes and in products, and to, over the next few decades, to essentially suck gigatons of CO2 out of the atmosphere and put it into a sort of some other solid form where it's not going to be causing climate change. So in that context, I think, you know, obviously things like the bioeconomy and particularly the circular economy are very important, because they're a clear way of, you know, reducing reliance on fossil sources and reducing the amount of products we use, particularly new materials. And the reason we're in this mess, I guess, is because there is a market failure. I mean, at the moment, it's far too cheap, effectively, just to use fossil resources from the ground, because there isn't an effective carbon price, and so the incentives to reuse and recycle things are not there. So, you know, one of the key policy challenges is how do we put a price on emissions and resource use that actually reflects the costs they impose on society. Just on the question of bioenergy, I think the point I'd like to make is it's very easy to think that, you know, something begins with the word bio must therefore be green, what's not to like, and I worry that there will be a sort of rush to move to a bioeconomy, to switch from fossil fuels, which is great, but in so doing, to sort of have all sorts of unintended consequences. And this is where there's a parallel with, I think, the EU bioenergy policies, where, you know, in a let's be charitable, in a sort of well-intentioned effort to reduce emissions, the EU subsidized, or the EU has, through member states, subsidized the use of bio-based sort of crops, like palm oil or rapeseed and so on, and thereby using land to produce biofuels, which actually have a higher greenhouse gas impact than the fossil fuels they replaced. Because either if you're using land to grow biofuels, you are either not growing food that would reduce deforestation elsewhere, which is a particular problem with things like palm oil, or you're reducing the amount of land that gets reforested or naturally reforests, which actually absorbs more carbon than you save by using the land to produce biofuels. So, you know, if you were to sort of decide to replace all fossil plastics with plastics from purpose-grown crops, from a climate perspective, in any case, you'd probably be doing something completely counterproductive. So I think the message I have is, yes, the bioeconomy is an important objective, but it needs to be done sensibly and without making the same mistakes that we've made in some other areas. And I think, just to finish, the point about fossil resources, which we use obviously for a large number of products today, is that you know, they took millions of years, if not hundreds of millions of years, to build up. It's millions of years of buried sunshine, effectively, and we can't simply replace all of that with biological sources of materials. And so, in fact, the circular economy is essential to making the bioeconomy work. We have to keep the carbon in the system and keep it, you know, going into products. And actually, we could almost think about bioenergy, like burning stuff, is what happens when the bioeconomy ends and when the circular economy fails. You know, that's burning things is the last thing you should do in many ways. So I'll finish there. Thank you.
Thank you, Alex Mason, for this bit of a warning and alert. Sylvain Lotte, from the perspective of paper and forest industries.
Thanks. I've taken a lot of notes, pages of notes, because for me it's also a learning exercise, and I'd like to bridge with some of the points. Maybe a few starting points. From a paper industry perspective, but I know it could be also the perspective of some other bio-based material industries. We are sourced in Europe. 85% of our entire feedstock is European. We are made in Europe with European technology. All the equipment manufacturers are European. The brains are European. The plants are in Europe. 90% of all the paper pulp products we use are European. And we are recycled in Europe. More than 70% of everything we put on the market is recycled in Europe. So that's for us one of the starting points, is that in the logic of building a competitive, circular, bio-based industry, we have made kind of a journey. Let's put it like that, and we believe we can go a little bit beyond. But I think it addressed some of the very valid points. It's true that Europe is, in terms of resources consumption, increasingly dependent on non-European based resources. And yet we are trying to compensate this by increasing the recycling, by better sourcing and better mobilizing the wood in Europe. That's part of the approach we are trying to follow. It's true that Europe is technology dependent in many, many fronts, and yet we have in Europe the chance to have the clusters of the best research centers, the best equipment manufacturers, and amongst the world leading companies. So we should be able to do something out of it. And that's really the starting point where we believe that this circular bioeconomy is a real chance for Europe. And it's a chance also for the million of people that are working into it. I mean, we have 1.5 million people working from the tree, the forest, down to the recycled paper and back to the loop. And more than 60% of them are in rural areas. I grew up in a rural area where there was no industry, there was only farming. And it was tough for the people there. It was tough for the people there. They would have had an industry developing together with the ecosystem, if I may say, locally, that would have changed a little bit the life in the villages where I was living. So I think that needs to be brought also in perspective. And then comes the climate perspective that Alex rightly remember. In the medium term, we do also believe there is no chance to maintain climate change within the boundaries of the Paris Agreement without massively defossilizing our economy. Now it's a matter of speed, pathways, pace, technologies, and so on and so forth. But we believe that there will be a range of solutions that will naturally come up. But I believe, like you, that it's time to accelerate, scaling up, and that's where initiatives like the R&D funding the European Commission is preparing for the Horizon Europe, next generation Horizon 2020, will be critical. When I visit the research centers of the companies and of the universities and others, I see amazing things. So the research is there. We need now to develop, scale up, deploy. And we need to deploy, bloody hell, in Europe. Have an example of a technology that was pretty impressive from my standpoint was a piece of paper that is water resistant, and yet that recycles absolutely normally in the paper streams. And that technology, called chromatogeny for the specialists, was first picked up by South Korea and deployed very quickly in South Korea. How can it be? How can it be? How can it be that we don't have the tools, the financing, the incentives to get those technologies invented in Europe by European brains, deployed in Europe? And that's maybe different context, different challenges, different reasons. I mean, I'm not finger pointing at anything, but we need to think how we're going to move from the lab to the market. How we're going to scale up the investments that are needed. And I think that's one of the challenge for the bioeconomy strategy, is really to scale up this transition. The second challenge, and to address the concerns expressed by Alex. I think we need undisputable data. We need to look back at the data. We need to look at the data in terms of biomass availability. I know the GRC is working on this, and it's needed. We need to look at what are the carbon savings benefits the products can bring. And okay, industry can do its jobs, but it will be always seen as industry data. Okay, whatever we do, it will be a little bit labeled, okay, that comes from industry, how did you do this, how did you cook this, and so on. So I would expect from the Bioeconomy Knowledge Center that has been put in place by the Commission to do much more to really look at, okay, what can it deliver with biomaterials kept in the loop? And I think that will be absolutely essential. And then third, I think we have done a lot of progress in many different fronts, and credit to the European Commission and the Circular Economy Package and other initiatives. Now, I think it's a matter of really implementing in a consistent manner those different policy tools or regulatory elements. We may not need another layer of things. But if I take a very practical example, we have, for instance, in the Circular Economy Package, Packaging Waste Directive that will be confirmed, fully adopted this week, a line, it's a recital that really mentioned the value of incentivizing the shift towards bio-based packaging systems. I would say, just do it. Just do it. Just do it at national level, maybe just do it in the public procurement guidelines. That doesn't need to be a long discussion. It should be just done. And that's what I think is a little bit missing. There's a lot of willingness to look at bio-based, bioeconomy, and so on, but we should just go for it. And I will just pause on this. I have plenty of examples of where we could just do it.
Good, thanks for that. Let me maybe then kick off the discussion by staying with this subject of research and then trying to achieve the next stage, which is actually helping products to actually make it to the market, enter the market. Just to get a sense for what the review will actually look like when it comes out. I mean, I understand the current strategy placed a lot of emphasis indeed on research. Is the new one going to move a little bit away from that and look more at how to practically put the innovation that came out of the research onto the market? Is that going to be the emphasis in the new strategy?
Yeah, I think many of the outcomes of this discussion are the focus of the new strategy. We talked about upscaling. Clearly that is necessary. We also talked about regionalization. I think that's also important. First of all, we have this, as Mr. Bogovic already mentioned, this BBI, the Bio-Based Industry Initiative, which has financed flagships all over Europe, which uses waste and biomaterials to add new value, to create new jobs on marginal, using crops on marginal land and all of this, trying to really add the technologies that can make the bioeconomy more circular. So these technologies are coming out. Of course, they need to be upscaled now. They need to be taken up at regional level. We have very good incentives in cities, for instance, in some of them, which are doing very good stuff. So I think what we need to do is, first of all, provide the financial instruments to do this upscaling. Also use the CAP maybe more, Common Agricultural Policy, to take up some of these new technologies and use them, on the spot. But we're working on the financial instruments, for instance, to do that. We're also looking at how to better work with cities, with regions, both coastal and rural areas, to really pick up these new technologies to implement. So that's going to be a focus of the strategy, two of the points. What we'll do invest a lot in research, because we do think the challenge is formidable. I mean, it's huge, and all of us have talked about the challenges, whether they are in climate issues. I mean, what are we going to, you know, do we want to replace housings to wooden housings, which would be also something where we can store lots of carbon. The question is, how much can we do that? Can we, you know, replace 20%, 100%? When are we turning this vision into maybe another disaster? I mean, that's really what we need to know. So we need to have a monitoring. We need to have something like a cockpit that tells us, okay, there's a bioeconomy pathway, we can go somewhere. So there are 10 lights. Ideally, all of them should be green. The climate light, the sustainability light, the soil light, and whatever lights you want to have in your cockpit. That's likely not going to happen. That's an ideal world. There's going to be some orange there. The issue is, let's make sure they're not too much red, or no red at all. I mean, that's where you want to go. And we don't even have the tools to maybe look at this in detail. And we have done mistakes and learned from them. Red lights have gone on. We've tried to turn them into yellow or back into green. So I think that is also important, and that's another focus of the new bioeconomy strategy, to really look at the impacts of certain bioeconomy pathways developments on the overall sustainability, economic, environmental, and social. Don't forget, the bioeconomy is about all these elements. Where the economy maybe means it's only economic, but we're looking at all sustainability aspects here. We're also looking at the planet itself as the source of all the biomass. If you kill the planet, the biomass source is going to go dead. And that's the end of a bioeconomy, clearly. So a bioeconomy has to work in the limits of the biosphere. That is very clear, and it's part of a bioeconomy strategy. So it is a sensible strategy. It's not looking only at the exploitation of biomass for certain sources, but it has to do it in a long-term sustainable manner.
So you're saying there's going to be, in the new strategy, more indicators to monitor progress in certain areas?
So research will be one, the uptake, scaling up, the regional uptake also, working with regions, the monitoring, we talked about biomass studies, but it's going to go beyond that also, trying to look at setting up indicators for the progress of the bioeconomy and models and how certain developments will impact certain features. So these are the main areas where we're going to work on.
So we're looking at something which is a bit more action-focused, as we said in the beginning, but very cautious at the same time, because you don't want to repeat the same mistakes that were made in the past. But let me ask the other panelists, do you agree this is the right approach? Because we had a sort of a call for action in a way coming from Sylvain Daudet, saying, you know, we must get out of the lab and get into the real world, but in a cautious way.
Yes, I totally agree with this, and I can say, for example, for Slovenia we made big mistakes in renewable to use corn for biogas, for example, and it was today everybody knows that 10 years ago the mistake was mistaken. I totally agree, and what is also very important, I have here in front of me one we called a roadmap towards the circular economy in Slovenia, and I think that as it's important that we have a European roadmap, it's necessary that each country knows and go in details and concretely to debate and find out this green light. Lights you said, because in country like Slovenia, which we have 60% of area covered by forests, and on one hand it's a big opportunity, but on the other hand we have only 880 square meter arable land per capita, so it's impossible to produce enough food and feed from this arable land, and so it's clear that each country must find its own focused, and all this action must be balanced by this green lights that I do. So that I think this is the right direction, and it's necessary to do. And what is, as I said at the beginning, what is very important, it's necessary that a lot of people understand this, not government or somebody else, and also this document was debated with many stakeholders before it was accepted. So I think it must be switching over heads also, not only in our technologies.
William Neal, maybe a reaction from your part?
Yes, I think Frederick, you summed it up when you basically said just do it, but I mean, yeah, just do it, but there are a lot of other impacts that we have to deal with, and Valdemar with his 10 lights, and Mr. Begovic talking about the trade-offs between corn for biogas and further production, are both heading in the same direction. I think that as we have the pressure on bioresources, we will have to we'll see more and more of these trade-offs, increasing demand on limited resources. But the trade-offs, I think circular approaches can help to mitigate and head off some of those difficult trade-offs, as I explained earlier. But I think there's a trade-off also between our use of bioresources and the other uses that the ecosystem has for those bioresources in terms of oxygen, in terms of water regulation, temperature regulation, our gene pool, biodiversity, and so on. So I think that when we multiply our adjectives that we apply to growth, whether it's low carbon, circular, sustainable, whatever, I think that we need to apply those adjectives also to the bioeconomy. And I think that one very useful framework to do that within is the Sustainable Development Goals, which we also need to look at. And I think we have many more than 10 lights that we have to try and make sure are green if we try and remain within that context and coherent with the Sustainable Development Goals.
Thanks. Let me remind you that you're welcome to put questions to the panelists or make remarks. And I think we'll have maybe a number of them coming from Twitter and social media, and we'll probably take a few from there later on. Alex Mason, maybe let me turn to you. We heard Valdemar talking about this monitoring system to make sure that we don't have those flashing red or orange signals. So what would you monitor? What do you think are the main things that we should keep an eye on? Is it mainly related to bioenergy? You seem to be placing a lot of emphasis on that.
Well, I guess, yeah, I mean, that's partly because I work on bioenergy, and I can't claim to be a great expert in other aspects of the circular economy and bioeconomy. I mean, that's certainly one, I guess, you know, from a climate perspective, which is where I'm coming from, you know, the key thing is to look at the life cycle assessment of the greenhouse gas impact. So you're not unwittingly incentivizing something that is actually not going to deliver any greenhouse gas benefit. Now, obviously, there are lots of other reasons to be interested in using bio-based products rather than ones that are sort of synthetic, not least because, you know, you might be reducing the amount of pollution. I mean, we've seen obviously in recent months a lot of attention paid to the amount of plastics that we have in the oceans. So I'm not saying there are not lots of other things that you'd want to be tracking. I guess the most urgent one in my mind is this risk that we create incentives at EU level through relatively sort of blunt policy instruments, which then have completely unintended consequences when implemented. And I think, you know, there's a risk that we here on this panel, and maybe most of us in the room, all agree with one another. I mean, we all completely agree with the objectives that we're discussing. The problem is that there are some very powerful forces who are not in this room, who obviously are not at all interested in seeing this develop, and
names, please,
who are very well financed. And I mean, well, I mean, you know, thinking about the obviously the fossil fuel industry, the agriculture lobby. I mean, there are lots of different corporate and other lobbies that would not be interested in some of the stuff that we think needs to happen, or not at the speed that we think it needs to happen. I was just going to pick up on a couple of things that other speakers said. I mean, on this idea of building more wooden housing, I think this is potential. This has potential. The idea of replacing very carbon-intensive products like concrete and steel with timber. I think, just again, and I'm always going to be the sort of dreary, cautious, wet blanket sort of figure here. But I mean, there is a risk even there that you incentivize the wrong thing, and you end up with lots of forests being cut down, only a tiny part of the carbon liberated actually ending up in a building, and maybe not even having a particularly beneficial effect on the sort of carbon balance, even compared to steel. I mean, there's a pilot plant being built soon in, I think, Sweden, where they're planning on making steel from using renewable electricity and hydrogen rather than coal. So if you're in a world 20 or 30 years from now where you have essentially decarbonized your steel and perhaps concrete production, harvesting trees for buildings might not be a very good idea at all, because actually forest is one of the only ways we can store carbon from the atmosphere, which is a priority. I mean, on the question of biofuels, I mean, I would love to believe that everyone now knows that it was a mistake, but the truth is that we're very far from that. I mean, the negotiations are going on in the Council and the Parliament at the moment in the trilogues on the Renewable Energy Directive, and the Council still wants to see a further increase from current levels of first-generation biofuel crops, including things like palm oil, biodiesel. So, we're very far from having convinced people, or certainly having succeeded in countering the messages put out by the various lobbies that this isn't a good use of land and is in fact counterproductive.
Sylvain, maybe let me put that question to you. I mean, we've heard that the European Union has learnt its lesson in a way, the hard way with the biofuels. There's a certain degree of cautiousness about what to do next, unintended consequences. Whereas you seem to be sort of calling for action. Is there a risk that we become overly cautious in a way, do you think?
We are so European. I spend a lot of time with my American friends, my Canadian friends, my Japanese friends, my Brazilian friends. There is a technology revolution, not on the horizon, it is happening now. Global. Either we lead the train or we will watch the train passing by the station. That's just about it. And I'm pretty blunt about it, because when I see, I'm going to take an example. I mean, cellulose has this beauty to be able to be engineered at a nano scale and to be one of the only, if not the only, nano component which is totally biocompatible. So it's the dream material for medical applications, for prosthesis, I mean, you name it, you have it. It can be 3D printed. It's fantastic. We are deploying this in Europe. We are making investments here and there and there. When I look at the plans the Japanese have in terms of scaling up the production and cutting the cost of production by a factor 10, even more, I'm looking at my colleague who's more versed on this, I think, oops, we need to go much faster in Europe. And then comes my reactions. We are so European. Oh my God, this may be nano. So nano classified as bad, irrespective of what kind of nano you're talking about. That's number one. And then, oh yeah, but where the feedstock, the resource will come from? I mean, the Japanese, they don't ask themselves the questions. And is Japan a big forested land with a lot of wood and so on? To be open as a question. And then comes the questions of, oh yeah, but who will share the technologies? And that's where I say we should just go for it. We are sitting on a gold mine in Europe. We are really sitting on a gold mine. At some point, we should go in the gold mine and exploit a little bit the gold mine. Now, I'm very happy to hear from Valmar that there will be better monitoring and elements to look at how this is moving on. I'm not preaching for subsidies. Europe is sick of subsidies. This has totally blurred the market with the bioenergy. That's one of the things that have totally put upside down the economic value of a lot of industries. We should unplug Europe from subsidies, but that means that we should also unplug the subsidies for the fossil-based industry. Aha! If the fossil-based industry is so competitive, it's because you have 100 years of stratified subsidized investments in petrochemical assets, in the gas pipelines, in the distribution of the things, which makes the scale and the competitiveness of an industry at the end of the day. So let's unplug all this. Let's bring the right carbon price. And then naturally the things should be able to go. But we need to go at those technologies. Otherwise, we will just watch the train passing the station and we will stay on the station.
Alex Mason, I'll turn to you in a sec, but I wanted to have maybe a quick reaction from Waldemar Kurt. Is this something that is also well perceived and understood in the European Commission as you prepare the update of the strategy, that there is a global competition going on, and how essentially are you looking at achieving this balance between not falling into the past mistakes that have been made and trying to catch that train that Silvano was talking about?
Lead the train. Drive it.
What we're trying to do is of course get this balance right. As you may know, the Bioeconomy strategy initially was, let's say, championed by DG Research. We're trying to change that actually because we think it's a policy that affects a number of different policy areas. So the current strategy is very closely developed with DG Agri, DG ENA, DG Environment, DG Grow, DG Mara, the JRC, but we also have ENA in there, Regio, and others. So SecGen is actually chairing the service meetings. So there's a recognition that the bioeconomy is not only a research-driven strategy, but it needs to do more in order to succeed. And so, and as I said, that's why we're trying to have a much broader strategy that looks also at, things like regulatory environment, financial things. Yes, we did a BBI now, and we invested $1 billion. There may be now need for follow-up investments which are better done by financial instruments than maybe grants. We have to look at this in detail, how to best do this. It's opening up also. The BBI was very much about classical, let's say, industrial bio-based products, but it's moving into all kinds of other things. I mean, the bio-based industries is much broader than just biochemicals. I think we're seeing these opportunities, and we're trying to provide, at least from a research point of view, the financial and grant instruments to move on and move ahead. Of course, on the regulatory side, we work with our colleagues of Grow and Environment and other to see what we can tackle, what needs to be done, and this could be, certain regulatory barriers for certain new bio-based products, which we'll have to look at and then maybe take action in these areas. That's part of the long-term strategy to look at. So we do see also, of course, the potentials. I mean, Europe is very good in chemical engineering. Europe is very good in sustainable production. I mean, the first circular economy was built in paper and pulp in Europe, I guess. So I mean, it's both bio-based and circular. So I mean, there's a long tradition in Europe there, and we have to look at these issues clearly to move on forward. But of course, there also needs to be a discussion between the different policy areas to balance this. and that's important to do. At least if you look at larger scale issues, that you know very well where you're going to.
Alex Mason, you
So,
wanted to
yeah,
react
well,
on
I
the
was-
subsidy issue, maybe?
Yeah, I mean, firstly, just to say, I mean, we are a conservation organisation, but you know, we're not opposed to technological progress. We don't want everyone to live in caves. So I think, you know, I would agree, I think, with Sylvain completely that there are enormous economic opportunities, and you know, if we're cautious about some things, it's not because we think that, you know, cellulose 3D printed prostheses are going to lead to global deforestation. I mean, I think, you know, that's sort of rather unlikely. But yeah, we're just sort of wary of subsidies being given in a very broad brush way for things that actually don't make any sense. I mean, we did a report a couple of years ago now with Mondi on cascading use of biomass, and you know, one of the conclusions of that was that while bioenergy is still subsidized, you won't see any effective cascades of biomass established. So, you know, I think we're cautious, but not in terms of sort of holding back progress. We're interested in things being done right, and you know, I think it's in the interest of people working in the bioeconomy to ensure that the bioeconomy doesn't get a bad name because of some of the sort of bad elements within it, if you like, the things that really make no sense at all.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I just made a note when you talked about these things like making everything out of the bioeconomy, whether it's fuels and all this. Of course, the limitations are clear. I just want to point you towards a study we made, a foresight study on the bioeconomy, which is like 2 years old, where we looked at different scenarios. And it was clear that in the high demand scenario for biofuels and bioenergy, it couldn't be done within the sustainability requirements of the planet. So the study clearly said you have to move, for instance, to power to liquid or other sources. So that's clear. I mean, you're not going to use electrochemistry to do food or whatever, but you can use electrochemistry to do basic chemicals that replace fuels or other things. So I mean, you have to look at how this is developed. It's a matter of financing these technologies, and we're talking about scales of 10, 20, 30 years here. So I mean, I think it is clear that the demand that some people have on bioenergy, if it really goes that way, is not going to be driven by biomass itself. It cannot be.
No, absolutely, and I think, you know, there are some things that we can only do with land, and they are things like producing food and producing, you know, carbon-based materials, and storing carbon, and then
taking a walk.
taking a walk. Yeah, this could be a long list, couldn't it? But you know, and then there are things where, you know, in the energy sector where you can, in most cases, do it another way, and we have to, because there simply isn't enough. There isn't anything like the amount of biomass to supply the bioeconomy and also to replace fossil fuels in the energy sector. I mean, the energy sector is obviously going to be based largely on wind and solar, combined with power to liquids and storage and demand response, and actually on renewable energy. This is another good example of Europe sort of missing the boat, or having been in the lead on renewable energy and making a lot of progress, and now being largely overtaken by China and the US in terms of deployment and investment in renewable energy.
It seems to me that a lot of the issues that we're discussing are related to volumes. As soon as volumes become big, and as soon as you have dedicated production for one particular usage, and biofuels was an example, this is when you start getting into problems. So does that mean that the bioeconomy is necessarily something which has to remain in sort of small volume kind of production? You're saying no?
No, I don't think so, because I mean, if it has to remain in small volume production, then how are you going to feed 10 billion people with the diets that we have right now?
So how do you prevent then this from becoming an issue if the volumes
you have to basically get more resource efficient in producing. So I mean, there's research on eco-intensification There's research on microbiomes in soils, which nobody maybe know what this is about, but it's essentially finding out whether we can put a tens or hundreds of the nutrients in the soil and still make the plants take up the same amount that they do now with the current amounts. So research is about finding ways to actually don't necessarily have to produce more on more land, but do the same on the same amount of lands. We haven't used more land in recent decades, but we still increased the agricultural productivity. So this is largely, okay, in some cases it may be to lots of fertilization, but a lot of these things have been precision farming, other things. There are new ways. I've just come from a global bioeconomy summit in Berlin, and I've heard one of Argentinian colleagues, they're now producing meat on grasslands where they have rows of trees in there, to produce shade, to use better the dung that from the cows in farming. So the overall climate aspect and resource aspect, efficiency aspect of that production system is much higher than any that is currently there. So it's about ingenuity, and that's why research and innovation, I think, is going to be very important for this in the future, because we're talking about systemic changes that we have to do. We have to find new solutions.
And we have to eat a bit less meat, because I don't think...
Well, sustainable consumption is the elephant in the room here, of course. Yes.
Because there's no way we stop climate change if the whole world adopts a sort of US or EU level of meat consumption. I mean, half the agricultural land in the world is...
consumption has gone down the last
Well, that's probably good for our health as well.
Yeah.
Okay, let's save that for later. Maybe William Neal on the volume issue, but you seem to wanted to react.
Well, I think we have a few lessons to learn from the abiotic side of the circular economy here. I think that what you're saying about waterproof paper sounds fantastic. It's a shame that we don't have that in Belgium. I think that'd be particularly useful here. And the miracles of materials like cellulose, we shouldn't just have the debate about products and about materials. What we've learnt from circularity when we were applying it generally is that we also need to look at systems, we need to look at consumption habits, and we need to look at business models. And there are many ways in which you can avoid just producing more stuff, whether it's more or less easy to recycle, more or less durable and so on, and actually have systems which enable you to keep the value in the system for longer. Now, bioeconomy is a little bit different maybe in terms of, for example, we talk about the sharing economy. Sharing food is a bit more difficult. It's nice to share a meal, of course, but there are specificities, as I said, in the bioeconomy. But I think we need to look at not just at getting away from this concept of just producing more stuff to deal with the demand rise, but actually the idea of circularity is to keep that value in the system and to make more use of it. So we can reduce the pressures.
So you're saying the volume issue can be addressed?
To a certain extent, or to a large extent, by circularity, yeah. Either by, as Waldemar was saying, by increased efficiency. You can go for precision farming. You can find lots of ways of increasing efficiency, but also by circularity.
I see we had one question coming from the floor here, gentleman in the middle.
Joachim Kreiser from JRC. I'm the bioeconomy advisor there. I think this question of scale is coming up very often in different discussions, and I heard somebody saying that we should simply forget about it because we are never going to be able to reach the scale which is necessary to run our economy as it is today. And I think this is right. So if we want to have a bioeconomy, we have to think about a different economy in total. And this is why it is so important to link it with the circular economy idea, because the circular economy means high efficiency in the production, in the primary production, as well in all processing steps every time. That means we have to avoid waste where we can. We should not go for most efficient waste recycling industry. It would be much better if we avoid waste from the beginning. If we do that, the raw material intake which the economy needs will be much less than what it is today. And suddenly it becomes much more feasible that the biomass and the bio-based role can play a much bigger role in our economy than we have it today. The other question is, do we really need to go for scale? Now we see in the electricity production what happened with the combination of renewable energy plus digital technology, that suddenly became possible to have a decentralized small-scale producers which are replacing big centralized producers. Can we think about doing something similar with biomass? Can we develop systems where we have many small processing facilities which can benefit from the local specific characteristics of the biomass and turn biodiversity into an asset instead of seeing it as something we have to counteract? And if you look at our agricultural system today, what has happened in the last 20, 30, 50 years, we have tried to reduce the diversity of the agricultural system in order to be able to produce enough. With using technology, digital technology and all these artificial intelligence, you name it, you also synthetic biology comes into it, combine all this high tech with system thinking, we might be able to do much more with these potentials than we do today.
So basically you're saying we can seek volumes and this is actually desirable. The decentralized aspect that you're talking of, this is essentially, it's waste collection, isn't it?
It could be. Yes, I think that this is the right direction in which it's necessary to think about, as you mentioned, digitalization and use of resources, use of also at that moment use of fertilizers, use of pesticides. You can reduce it a lot and less influence on the environment. And here are these big data things. If we see a lot of changes that we have, for example, gardens in the city, how people share these vegetables, how you connect with digital producer and consumer, small-scale producer and consumer, also energy sector, blockchain technologies, and here are many really opportunities. And I also work on one topic of smart villages, and we launched one preparatory action on to exchange these good practices. And I think that here is the right direction. Also, as I said, I see this in it's not only in Slovenia; it's all around Europe. A lot of on TV you can see a lot about cooking, and it's changing a lot. That people, young people, cook again, and I think all these changes which happens and are part of these changes. When I said also at the beginning that we must change ourselves, and through this it is also be more active, eat less fat, less meat, and such things. And I think that as I see situation in Europe and also in my country, we go in the right direction. For example, Slovenia, we are well known as beekeepers, and this week we will celebrate first World Bee Day. And for example, it is absolutely new that in last 2-3 years we have many city beekeepers. It was not in past; it was only in rural areas. And now I think it's a lot of things are changing, and I think that people are aware that it's necessary to change ourselves. And I think through this and through new technologies, then we can succeed. Otherwise, not. And it's different scale. And for example, as I said, in forestry in Slovenia, for example, there are quite good forestry. We have about 7 cubic meters new wood per year, and it's necessary that we count it between, I don't know, 4 and 6 cubic meter per year. We can cut, otherwise we will have problems. So that this is our balance of material, and then you go through this material. What is the best use of this material? And then is again a hierarchy of use of material. So that all this is combined with also local specific and behavior.
Good. I see there's one more question here, gentleman in the middle.
Yeah, thank you. My name is Andreas Turner from the Austrian Chambers of Agriculture, and I'm also a member of the European Economic and Social Committee. And a lot of aspects have been mentioned now, and I would like to react on some of those. And maybe the Economic and Social Committee is also carrying out an exploratory opinion on the role of bioeconomy in the contribution to achieving the climate and energy targets and the sustainable development goals. So we are just about to start the work, actually. And it was mentioned the role, or actually Alex said that agriculture is missing in the room, but I think agriculture is one of the crucial partners when it comes towards the bioeconomy and also a circular bioeconomy, and agriculture can contribute a lot, and I think we are willing to contribute a lot. There's a huge potential in there. You mentioned the example of forests and wood products, and you mentioned the target of capturing of CO2 in the forests. Of course, this is one part of it, and the next step would be to store this carbon dioxide also then in products, in wood products, long-lasting wood products, and maybe then only in the end, if circular economy allows this, then we could also still talk about energy production. So there is a lot of potential in there, and also sustainable active forest management. So it's not only about capturing in carbon dioxide in forests. If we do a sustainable and active forest management, we can capture even more, because forests grow faster, stronger, if the management is proper done and in a sustainable way, which will feed into the all the chain then, which would follow after. So there's always, of course, the management has to be done in a sustainable manner, and then we come to these guidelines, the red, green, orange lines. Yes, but I think in Europe we have a lot of knowledge and systems in place that allow to actually guarantee a sustainable forest management. Then, Mr. Bogovic, you referred to biofuels, and that it was rather a mistake. I think also there it is valid to differentiate. In Austria, for instance, we have a biorefinery working on this with producing bioethanol from corn, from wheat, actually. Mainly, they're using rather low quality resources, which would be rather difficult to use for feed and definitely not for food anymore. And then this refinery actually does not only produce ethanol out of this raw material, but also a high quality source of protein as a byproduct, which actually is kind of the same amount as if we would produce. So from 1 hectare of wheat, we get the same amount of protein via this production as we would get if we would grow soya on that hectare. So basically, it's not either or; it's an and in this question. So, and then we were talking actually a lot now about rather the push side. So, what can the Commission, the regulator, what can we do to promote bioeconomy? Now, my question would go to the other side. So, rather on the consumption side, what could we do to actually get the consumer, who has an important role in this, in a position that he would rather pulse. So there's the push side from the Commission, from the regulatory bodies, and then we should try to also get the pull side from the consumer perspective, so that they really ask for wooden houses, that they ask for bioenergy, that they ask for cloths based of natural fibers, for instance. So that would be my question to the panel. How can we actually get the consumer even stronger on board than we have them already now. Thank you.
Okay, who wants to have a go on the pull side briefly, because we don't have more than 5 minutes left now.
I think we'll get the consumer on our side if we can demonstrate to the consumer that the product, the solution he can acquire are sustainably sourced locally in Europe. That's at the end of the day what people will care about. Are you deforesting Malaysia or not? That's what the consumer will care about at the end of the day. Is it contributing to the job in my constituency or not? That's what the consumer cares about at the end of the day. And then ultimately, is it more expensive or not? And that's what people care when they go to the retail shop next door. Maybe a very important point. We have in Europe the biomass available. The European forest biomass is growing. It is growing. So the increment on an annual basis is 1.2 billion cubic meters. Half of this, more or less, I'll let the experts discuss about the figures, half of this is not available because it's protected areas, it cannot be harvested. The other half is available, and out of this, we only use 60% of this commercially available biomass. So we have a long way to go. We can still grow and sustainably grow the use of the wood biomass in Europe. I think one of the questions would be on the sustainable mobilization part. I mean, that's maybe the second pillar of the common agricultural policy on rural development, where we may have to think about how we make the biomass more sustainably mobilized in Europe. That's an element we haven't talked about, but I mean, I guess it would require a much longer panel if we start to touch on the CAP reform than just looking at the bioeconomy. But I think it's part of the equation, but we need to repair and rebuild the confidence of the consumer. We have the available sustainable biomass in Europe. So let's build on this.
Yeah, on the pull policies?
Yeah, so I think Sylvain's right. I mean, the consumer will be attracted by price and where things are produced. And as I said at the beginning, one of the problems at the moment is that the price of carbon and the price of resource use is not taken into account in a lot of the products that are on the market. So if we had a decent carbon price, then obviously the products that were made from reused or recycled materials would be more attractive to the consumer than they perhaps currently are. On forest growing, I mean, that's true. EU forests are growing. One of the reasons is, or the main reason is because we spent hundreds and hundreds of years cutting them all down. I mean, Western Europe used to be one of I think it was the third largest deciduous forest in the world. So yes, it's true that forests are now recovering, and that's very, very good news, particularly as I say, we are facing a desperate, urgent need to tackle climate change. And you know, the climate impacts of stuff, it's not really how the forest is managed, although that's very important for other reasons. It's what you do with the wood. And if we're using it for products, that's a very, very different sort of equation from if we're encouraging people to burn it. And I certainly wouldn't want to see consumers encouraged to burn more biomass instead of use wind and solar. So.
Indeed, that's a whole debate. William Neal, you wanted to react on the pull aspect?
Yeah, on the consumer side, I mean, I think this is very important. It's one half. I mean, we're very much concerned with supply push and the research side with technology push, but of course it's market pull and it's consumer pull, which is very important, and consumer behaviour. There's a limit to the ways in which we can influence that through policy. And here, I think what's clear from all of this discussion is we're talking about immense complexity in supply chains in general, all of the different factors that you have to take into account. I mean, how does a poor consumer, let alone, I mean, we can't decide here, but how does a poor consumer making a product choice decide what is the more sustainable choice? There are so many different parameters that they have to go through. We can help with eco-label. We can help with product environmental footprinting, which we're doing. We can help by trying to bring in incentives in the system. We have eco-modulation of extended producer responsibility schemes, which is, we'll go into that after we've done the CAP, I think. But I think that one of the most important answers we touched on before, which is the digital agenda and the possibility, A, to manage huge amounts of data, and B, to make that accessible to people and to communicate that data. And I think in terms of making more informed consumer choices, and also in terms of business models like sharing and so on, which mean we need less stuff, I think that the digital agenda is one that we'll have to connect to the bioeconomy agenda and the circular economy agenda in the future.
Okay, maybe to wrap up, I'll ask each one of you to, and maybe starting with you, Alex Mason, from what we've heard today, are you confident that the revised strategy that should be presented in September will avoid the mistakes of the past?
I'm sure that the Commission, having heard all of us speak today, will ensure that that's the case. No, I mean, I think, you know, as I said, we probably on this side, not in this room, probably all agree on a lot of this stuff. I think it is, you know, being aware of the players that do have different views and who, you know, have different interests and are financed to pursue them. But no, I'm confident, having heard what I've heard today, that the new updated strategy will be very good.
Waldemar, Kurt, maybe you want to say a few final words about what you've heard?
No, I think, as I said before, I mean, we've already seen that some of the core things that we want to do in the strategy was obviously mentioned here. You know, scale up, but also getting into the regions, looking at the aspects also of the ecosystem, making sure that the bioeconomy works inside the ecosystem. You know, putting efforts into research innovation for new innovations. I think all these things are clear to everyone. And I'm confident that, you know, we're not thinking here totally out of scale and out of reality here. And we've listened also, of course, to member states. We have a bioeconomy panel where we have from NGOs to you know, industry associations, everybody in there, and we looked at, of course, their input also. So I'm rather confident that you know, our internal thinking vibrates a lot with the external thinking.
Franz Bogovic?
Yeah. Yes, we really, as you said, we heard a lot of different things, and what is very important, I think that it's like in many other debate, that debate always should be and, not or. So that it's, things can go together. We must have a lot of knowledge about this. For push these technologies, I totally agree with colleague from Austria. He said case in Slovenia was to have 400 hectares corn for 1 megawatt and producing biogas and nothing else. No vegetables, nothing, no use of energy. And we made also many mistakes, so we must learn on good cases, good practices, and how to push this, try to also to answer, as I said at the beginning, with new products. For example, I follow some studies about sugar beet production, what is not just for sugar and other things. There are vitamins, there are other products, 27 products are in this study which are useful for different industries. So there are innovation and research and new products. On another hand, also that these products are useful. For example, we spoke in European Parliament about bio-based, biodegradable plastic and mulch film for production in vegetables production. And there must be the price and the results of this must be clear. What are results on the and influence on the soil on one hand, and on the other hand, if it's useful for farmers also. So I think that there is a lot of possibility, creativity, and communication.
William Neal, maybe a few brief final thoughts.
Just a couple of words to say that, I mean, from experience with talking about circular economy for a few years, we say that it's not really a policy choice, circular economy, it's inevitable. And I think when you're looking at the equation of the increasing demand for global resources and the limits on those resources, we will move towards a more circular approach, whether we like it or not, and that's very much the case also for the bioeconomy. What we can do with policy is to ease that transition, reduce the dislocation, try and manage some of the trade-offs, try and make sure that the obstacles are reduced and that the systems are in place and the incentives are in place. And I'm confident that we're heading that direction with the bioeconomy strategy and the circular economy action plan.
Sylvain Lot, to conclude, you were calling for the European Union to action. Are you satisfied with what you heard?
The proof of the pudding is in the cooking, or vice versa. No, it's how you said English. Actually, it's the proof of the cooking. I think I'm ending this discussion a little bit more confident that we will find the right way, because whatever the perspective I heard, we are not far off. I mean, it's very convergent. It's moving in the same direction. It goes without saying that for us, it won't be all about using virgin fibers or all about using recycled fibers. It will be a combination of the two, if I may say. And that's why we are systematically building this circular bio-based industry. And actually, when I look around the world, we are the world leading circular bio industry. I mean, it's not known in Europe, but the paper-based industry in Europe is the world leading circular bio-industry. Full stop. So, I mean, so there is something where I believe we are not good as European, and I think Commissioner Moedas has repeated this. We are not good in Europe at telling about our successes. So, and that's something we could really build upon. I hear the different routes and paths, and I'm confident that there will be some of those that will materialize. And I'm also confident that learning from the, sorry to put it black and white, but learning from the biofuel mess that took place on the first generation and all those debates, we will deliver much more value with the bioeconomy for tomorrow. So I'm pretty confident. Yeah.
Good. Thanks for joining us today, and I hand over the floor to my colleague.
Thank you, Fred, for leading the discussion, this rich discussion. I would like to thank our distinguished panelists. I would like to thank you for participating. I would like to thank Marta for organizing this event, our multimedia team. Before we leave, I have one final remark. In the folders on your chairs, you will find a feedback form. Please take a minute or two to fill it in, to complete it, because it's really crucial for us to have your feedback to organize better events for you. I hope to see you at our next event. Have a wonderful and sunny afternoon. Thank you for coming.
The stupid thing is, I mean, the EU is about to adopt, despite having had its fingers burned on biofuels, it's about to adopt a new renewable energy directive with essentially no meaningful restrictions on forest biomass at all. And all you're going to see is a sort of ongoing massive increase in harvesting of forest and use of trees for energy. And it's now